Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
Let's welcome today's speaker, our past secretary, Gregory C.
I'm Gregory C. I'm an alcoholic. You know, I was thinking today if I could keep one promise I made to myself, and I've already broken it. The promise was decide how you're going to start speaking. And I thought of AA paradoxes and oxymorons. And what came to me is, I remember my first blackout. And the scary part is I do. You know, I had... Now, I'm going to warn you all, I have been told I talk fast. I probably will, and then I'll try to make myself slow down as I realize that, you know, I'm going to pass out. But I am the youngest of 4 children. I'm a military brat. And what that means is, well, it means a lot of things. It means that my father was in the Air Force, which was the military part. It means that I grew up, when you'd ask me where I was from, I'd say, what year? And, you know, it would be like, well, we lived here, and then we lived there, and we lived there. But the truth is that, you know, and this is what I like to say, and everybody who's ever heard me share has heard me say this. We were, my family, part of the military's experiment with integration. You know, basically Truman has said, you guys are going to integrate the armed forces. It's going to happen. It's in the law. It's what's going to happen. And we were part of the first people to do that. So I basically grew up in rooms like this one, where there were about as many people of color as you see, if that many. And it influenced how I saw myself in the world. It influenced how I felt in groups and crowds. And, you know, it's one of those things that I'm really grateful for. I'm really grateful that I grew up at a time where something like that could happen, because it's been really positive for my family and for lots of other people's families and for the world in general. But anyway, but what it really meant is you moved around a lot. You know, you live here for a couple of years, you get in the car, you drive somewhere else. And the other thing I like to share when I'm speaking is, oh yes, this is the other thing you got to get out of the way, because for people who don't know me, it bothers a lot of people with time to have no idea how much time the speaker has. How much time does he have? You know, what's his qualification? And my sobriety date is 4/26/2000, so I'm 18 years, 2 months, and a few days. And I'm really happy to be able to say that in this room. Because most of my time sober, I've had some commitment and been in this room. And before I go any further, I want to thank Vicky for asking me to speak today. Because, you know, as far as I'm concerned, the outgoing speaker may be a tradition, but it's not a done deal. You know, he still has to be asked, you know, if he's going to speak. And it was a great honor and privilege to have this commitment. You know, because I brought up what I just brought up, I want to say that, you know, as far as I know, I'm the first African-American secretary of this room. And that is another thing. Yeah. See? And I'll take applause wherever I can get them. But I don't say it to get applause. I say it because it's the truth. Now, here's what also affected me. I had alcoholism in the family. My mother's mother, and she was telling me this since I can remember, was the town drunk in her town in Arkansas, where she grew up in. She had been an alcoholic. She had really been, there weren't too many alcoholics walking around. And she said all the time, I got sober in the church. I became the church cook. And I went on from there. And I was really proud of my grandmother because, you know, first of all, she really was a good cook. My mother wasn't bad, but my grandmother was outrageous. And she would get on a Greyhound bus from Arkansas, where she lived, and travel to whatever Air Force base we were at. And some of them were Oxnard Air Force Base up here in Camarillo. And so I spent years here in the 60s, which really changed how I lived and thought about myself. McClellan Air Force Base in Sacramento. Those are the California places. Then there's Dayton, Ohio. There's Newfoundland, Canada. There's Satellite Beach or Cape Canaveral, Florida. And I tell you all this because this is not what makes me an alcoholic, all the traveling, the recreating of your persona wherever you go, but it affects me. And, like I said, because I knew alcoholism ran in the family, I was being told to watch out for it. My father's message to me was when he was in college, because he left the Air Force to go back to college so he could become an officer, which he did, and he would look out, he said, I'd look out in the park and I'd see those alcoholics drinking and playing cards and having fun, and I'd really want to join them. But I couldn't, because I had to finish my degree and I had to get, and I did. And I'm like, as a kid, I'm thinking, what is so attractive about the alcoholics in the park? That's not what I would want to do. But, as I grow older, of course, I knew. Now, because this is an AA meeting, and we had somebody at their first AA meeting. I believe her name is Patricia that came up for the first. I'm sorry? Mallory. See, Mallory, you didn't say it into the microphone. And I just want to welcome you to Alcoholics Anonymous. You are in the right place, As a former secretary of ours used to say to a lot of newcomers, and I love to say it to you, we're sorry it's come to this. I know, just what I want to do, end up in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. I kind of, had the experience where, no, I did not want to have to come to Alcoholics Anonymous, but I did identify and admire a lot of people who turn out to be alcoholics, whether they, admitted it or not. My favorite line, the other thing I got to say is, I had mental illness in the family, and my oldest brother was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, and it was then and the time called emotionally ill. He was... he had to do some alcoholic things first. He had to, crash the family car, and really get outrageous. And he had been, the straight-A student. He could play any instrument he picked up. He had been my hero. And I tell people, I watched him disintegrate right in front of me. And so, I had this experience of watching my father accept the fact that his eldest son, his namesake, was not only unstable and probably an alcoholic, but mentally ill in a way. And I'll never forget him telling me this. Jimmy's really sick, and he broke down in tears. I'd never seen my father cry. He tells me when he grew up he had been a crybaby, but I almost never saw him cry. And I said, I don't know how this story works, but So he's crying, and I'm going like, well, he could get better. This is how the Al-Anon in me started. He could get better. We could help him. We'll go. We'll see what happens. But I had a lot of shame around it because my brother would, he'd be talking to you. He would have a lot of brilliant things to say. He would, change the way we looked at music forever, because he was the one that dropped acid with Roger McGuinn and the Byrds and never was the same. He brought back the music. Now we got Jimi Hendrix. Now we got the Beatles. Now we got Bob Dylan. Now we got, Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. Now we have, to go with all the Miles Davis and the Supremes and all the other stuff that everybody else wants to listen to. And I say that because music... I'm going to resist the urge to say hi to a friend of mine, because music has really influenced my life in ways that I wanted it to, in ways that I didn't. Anyway, my first experience with alcohol was just watching parents' parties. My parents would have their friends come over because they were in the military. They had really good, very inexpensive alcohol. They had really full bars, We got the Drambuie, and we got the this kind of wine, and all the kinds of stuff, you never even heard of. The sherry and the sherbet, and the green stuff, and the pink stuff, and the whiskey. And my first experience with was the party. You try something out. Well, this tastes pretty good. This tastes all right. And then this is awful. How could you drink this? Why would you ever want to drink this? And one of my father's favorite drinks was Crown Royal, and I that Regal Crown Royal that had this giant bottle, and I used to put quarters in it. And I used to so basically I thought of Crown Royal this is the best whiskey, and you should try this, and it'll help you when the time comes. And, I was on my way to being what I thought was a responsible recreational drinker. And what happened was at 13, they showed us the movie, They used to show in the schools, in the public schools, I mean, literally in Camarillo, they show you the movie about, well, not Camarillo, Virginia by this time. Now we're in Hampton, Virginia. We're in Langley. My father has become a spook. Anyway, it's true, there's a CIA works there in Langley. That's really what happened. Anyway, but the point is that they showed this movie on marijuana and, the evils and dangers. I'll never forget they had this kid running on the top of a train. He's running on the top of a train, and he's really happy. He's having a really good time, and all of a sudden, he, of course, jumps in between trains and loses his leg. And so it's like, jump, and the next thing is no leg. And we saw this, and we're watching this, and me and my buddies are like, where can we get some? By the end of the day, and this means that I was hanging out with the alcoholics, obviously, because we're entertained, but because mental illness runs in the family, because I have been going to, the early stages of group therapy, because, I have, shame and a little confusion about what really is kind of like, we talk about it in the rooms, the elephant in the living room, because you got a mentally ill brother, and you don't want to talk about it too much because, you don't really understand it. There is some family shame. But, the great thing about Jim was he was brilliant, and he didn't have any fear, it seemed. It's like the nice thing about being crazy is you're never bored, and you're not really worried about all that much. It's like, hey. But I would see him break down. I would see him cry. I would see that, he couldn't find a place, and as I realized, and because believe me, the other part of it was he used to start beating us up. This is what made him have to go in the hospital, because I, as the youngest, went, I've got this mentally ill brother who's now, disintegrated in front of me, and now he's kind of a monster, he's dangerous, and I'm thinking, like, hey, he must sleep sometime and with his eyes closed. We'll take care of this. You guys aren't going to do something. So that's kind of helped with the hospitalization. Anyway, we had to do this marijuana, and I was a real lightweight with marijuana because I did this. I studied it. I said, do all the homework, read the president's list on it, and it was like, what can go wrong with marijuana? Well, there's only two things that really was the fear. One was losing short-term memory, and the second was it could lead to harder drugs. And I thought, neither one of those things will happen. So I will go ahead and I will continue. And of course, both of those things happened later on. Now, the fast forward, life went on, I say, for years I've been saying we had a dysfunctional family, but the truth is we were relatively functional. My sister and I both, went to college. I came down here at about 18 and tried to pursue a career in entertainment and computers, got married, had one of those shifts where I had been hanging out with, the creative artists, the musicians, actors, directors, and people really on that mission. But also I had this, really love of computers. And, to me it was like, this is going to be the wave of the future, and we're going to do this. And, so I had this kind of dual career going. Things were going really well. And I always say, really happily married, almost happily married. The truth is that I'm an alcoholic, and I always want something to be, I always wanted kind of better, different, or more, And that better, different, or more kind of started easing in. And, wherever you have any kind of character defects, alcohol and drugs, and alcohol is a drug, basically activate that stuff. And so because I had been so cautious, because I had, I was thinking last night about a friend of mine in high school. In my high school, I had been vice president of my high school and become president of my high school. When I was vice president of my high school, I led this walkout that got this nationwide attention. What were we walking out for? Smoking areas. Smoking areas, dress code, really important things, And this is in Cape Canaveral, Florida. And so when Parkland happened, I actually felt really akin with him. I said, I know what it's like to be all excited about something and have it thrust in your lap, but it wasn't anything like as important and in life and death as that. But, for alcoholics, what we kind of discover is, and this is to mention what somebody said, you better be good. It's kind of like you better be funny, when you're up here. You better entertain. And I'm going like, you're on a life and death mission, but make them laugh, And I remember arguing with one of my sponsors who I was fortunate to have speak here. I remember arguing with Frank. I said, it's not about being entertaining. You need to carry a message of depth and weight. You need to make them understand the three-part, problem of alcoholics. You got a mental obsession, you got a spiritual malady, and you got a physical allergy. Physical allergy, mental obsession, and a spiritual malady. And those three things, I go, look, 2 out of 3 most people have. Most people have some kind of spiritual malady, and they have a mental obsession over something. But the physical allergy, that thing that happens to us when we take a drink or a drug and put it in our system, and all of a sudden, we now do not know how many we're going to consume, what our behavior is going to be like, what we're going to say, or if we do know what we're going to say, what our behavior is going to be like, we can't alter it when it's necessary to do so, when it would be in the best interest of a mature, loving person. And for me, that moment didn't come until I was, approaching 40. And I always like to say, I got greedy. I had, these wonderful children who are, becoming incredible adults. I really love my sons. Both of them have been here. Both of them have been here actually a lot. My eldest son was here just a few weeks ago, and I was really pleased to find out. And by the way, he is one of us. I had to, at some point, say, you know what? I can help you, but you're going to have to go into rehab. So he's the one that the eldest went into Promises. And that saved his life, changed his life, enriched his life. So anybody that's here through a rehab or sober living, I just want to say that is an incredible gift to be able to do, to be able to recognize that you need help, have the strength to ask and receive it, use it, and get better. And I've gotten a chance to work on them over the 18 years. But anyway, what happened for me is that, that greed turned into panic when problems started. My mother got sick and died of cancer. My ex-wife's only sister was shot to death by her ex-husband after court, after they had, made the decision how things were going to be divided up, and she was going to her stores to get her stuff. And I had told her on the phone, I said, look, I know everybody says, your ex-husband is just a problem guy, but I've had to study psychology. He worries me. Don't ever be alone with him. Please take care of yourself, have somebody go. And she did. She had somebody go with her to the storage, still shot to death, and we're literally, my father is taking us on a vacation to Jamaica, which is another part of how my, use increased. And I get this, blood-curdling scream from my now ex-wife that her sister is, has been shot. And he shot her to death and shot himself to death. And I think like right after that, somebody else, really well-known singer had the same thing happen. So it was like bam, bam, So we got on the plane, we flew to St. Louis, we went to Miami, and I was able to show up and be, I was able to show up and be a loving husband for that. But, it shattered us. For people who don't have a really stable program, who don't have a spiritual life that, like we say around here, under any circumstances we can use, like here, when tragedy happens, we allow ourselves to use these tools. We work these steps, we call our sponsors, we go to meetings, we're of service, we do these things. And but I didn't have that yet. And so, friends of mine who had known me back in my experimental days when I was, doing a lot of stuff with movies and television were continuing to get high. They were heavy drinkers. And I started hanging out with them and not going home or going home really late. And, one day somebody showed up, and I was drinking a lot of tequila. And I remember going, God, Gregory, you were the one that became the PTA dad, and we were really proud of you. Now you're like hanging with us every night. You're drinking. You're starting to drink too much. And when, people who I now think of as alcoholics tell you you're drinking too much, you really don't listen to them. It's like, listen, this is the pot calling the kettle black. And, what do you guys really know? I'm the one that's been straight all these years. But then they introduced, some other drugs. And cocaine showed up, and I always like to say my first experience with cocaine was like life becoming Technicolor. Now I can drink the way I really should be drinking because I'm not, I wasn't a good drunk. I would get sick before I got as drunk as I wanted to get. They say around here that, if you have to control your drinking and you're an alcoholic, you're miserable. Because why would you ever want to stop drinking just before it really starts working? And then once it really starts working, it works you, it consumes you, it takes over. And that started to happen. I started drinking lots of tequila. I started drinking lots of my favorite Crown Royal. Even though we were working, even though we were friends, between the drugs and the alcohol and the fact that we weren't able to be really honest with each other. We weren't able to help each other. We've been friends. They'd watch me get married. They watched my kids grow up. But they said, Gregory's just, he's basically disintegrating. And they had their comments, but they couldn't help me because, they weren't sober. And I caught a case really quickly. I caught this case where paraphernalia got pulled over. I had some paraphernalia in the car. There was actually nothing in the car. But they gave me a paraphernalia ticket. And then about 2 years later, I got a more serious charge because by then I'm hanging out with somebody who's got, look, we had this guy show up with a suitcase. Somebody said something to me about Better Call Saul today, and I thought, this guy showed up with a suitcase full of anything you wanted. Really, anything, anything in the chemical drug world. And I always like to say, he took checks, And at the time I'm writing these checks, they're actually good checks because I'm working, but as, time progressed, all of a sudden you can't really cover the check, and once you can't cover the check, that's gone. Now you need to get more sources, which we did. But now you're on the street. Now you're in danger. So anyway, I had this friend of mine who had been, one of my, drug connections, and he had started shooting. And I watched him in the space of like 8 months run out of veins. I said, dude, how can you run out of veins so fast? He said, well, And I was afraid for him. I was afraid for him because, I'm a military brat, it's like, which means is nobody dies on our watch. If somebody comes over to our place and something happens to them, we're getting them back. We're getting them home. Something happens, we're getting them to the hospital. So I said, I'm going to get you back to your sober living. He was actually into sober living. He had 2 strikes. So, I said, I'm going to get him high because I don't want him dying on me, and then I'm taking him to sober living, and I'm driving him in this new car I had, which I hadn't yet paid for. I was starting to miss bills and starting to miss, those kind of connections. I already have this, little case. Anyway, get pulled over by the police, got felony amounts of cocaine and heroin in the car. And I said, I'm taking responsibility for everything in the car. He says, are you sure? You got felony amounts. If you spread it out with your partner here, you'll have misdemeanor amounts. And I said, no, my mission was to get him to his sober living. He's got 2 strikes. No, everything's mine. And he couldn't believe it, and I could barely believe it. It was my first selfless acts as an alcoholic. But what it did was it put me in jail. It gave me felony convictions, and it made me have to go to the program, which I did not do. Now that I'm here, I'm like, okay, you've crossed the line. You have crossed that invisible line. You are no longer a cucumber. You are a pickle, You're never going to return. Go for it, And I remember, I always say this. I remember watching people, who well-known drug addicts, Daryl Straube, going to jail. Steve Howe, pitcher for the Dodgers, going to jail. Robert Downey Jr. going to jail. I wanted to protest. I said, you can't put Robert in jail. You just fell asleep in somebody else's house. What's the big deal? But I can't do that because I'm, a wanted person. And what happened was one of the people that I had been partying with and using with and talking with had been in Alcoholics Anonymous. And she had gotten sober. She had had 7 years sober before I met her. And she gave me that little book, the little blue book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I remember saying that and going like, oh, I know what this is. This doesn't work. If this worked, you wouldn't have to keep going to meetings. And I said, I studied psychology. That's how we define the fact that it doesn't work. But I took it anyway because I love books, and I read it. And all of a sudden, I knew what was wrong with me. I knew I'm an alcoholic. I need a spiritual experience beyond the one I grew up with. And I grew up in a family full of faith. The God thing was not a problem for me. And if the God thing is a problem, look, God is, as we understand him, is defined by every single alcoholic differently. I always tell people, look, if you're in any religion or not, if you're a Buddhist or not, you have your own relationship with your spiritual practice. Even if you go to a mosque or if you go to wherever you go, you have your own specific one. And so, what happened was I had a really powerful spiritual experience. And I said, I'm going to do this. So I went back to that judge. I'd done nothing he told me I had to do. He let me out on my own recognizance. I had owned property, never been arrested before. But I had done nothing. So now I'm looking at 3 years because I've done nothing. But I did walk into the courthouse. I always tell people I went to court. I went to a jail in Linwood. I didn't know where Linwood was till I got arrested there. No, Linwood, where the hell is that? Well, that's where you've been arrested. And the courthouse is literally on top of the jail. So I walk in, a free person. I mean, I'm basically, walking in, doing everything I can get my hands on, and I get in front of the same judge. And I said, I didn't do anything you said I should do, and I know I'm out of time. I know you could just throw me in jail, but please, I mean, really, I was pretty much, just like that. And he said, I'll give you a week to get in the program. You should have been in it 2 years ago. I said, well, I've got this little misdemeanor in Culver City. He said, I don't care about that. So you go to Culver City, you tell them what I'm doing, that I'm giving you a week with your felony conviction, and see what they say. And I don't know where this courage came from. It came from having read the book and believing in it. I went to Culver City, and that judge looked at me, and he goes like, I've seen this work before. Sometimes you guys get sober and you help other people. So I'm going to give you the same week. So I then, called up my ex-wife, and I'm, basically homeless at this point because I'm just afraid to go home. I know how I am. I know I've become this other person. I don't trust my temper. I don't trust, what can happen. And so I say, look, I need, I need, a couple $100 to get into this program. She said, you told me to stop giving you money. You said you would just drink it and turn it to drugs, don't give you a dime. I said, well, you haven't done anything else I asked you to do. Just give me the money. Please. And she did. And I went to this place, and I remember, they have this list of programs, and it was called Alternative Action. And I know, I look back at it now, I go, well, Alternative Action, AA, and the guy who was there had just been fired. And they told me, man, there was a really cool guy running. You weren't going to be tested. You weren't going to, but he's getting fired now, and this new guy told his story. And he said, he'd gotten sober, and through the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous and going to meetings, he told his story. He basically is a guy who called the cops on himself, got paranoid, called the cops on himself. That's how he got arrested. That's how he got started. And I asked him where he went to meetings, and I went there. And, because of the book, look, our book, written in 1935, I love Alcoholics Anonymous because the book itself, I always tell people, I liken it to like this. It's like reading the book before you go see the movie, and the movie's just as good as the book. I was certain that I knew how to do these steps, too. I said, I can figure this out. 1 through 12, let's see. I know what I don't want to do. I know what was coming. I'm lazy. 4 and 9, those are going to be the hardest ones. I'm going to do those first. I don't have a sponsor. So, I write the best, voice that I'm capable of writing. And I make an amends to my partner dealer, and he immediately understands what's happening. Oh, he done got religion. He done got AA. He's dangerous. I got to kick him out of here. And that's how I literally became homeless, because now I got no place. And he had my car, too, And I made amends to him. I said, that time, we had that disagreement. Well, here's that. And now he knew I was serious. So I was my beginning, and I was going to everything. One of my speakers, Joey, talked about Mickey Bush. And Mickey Bush used to have this, thing he would say. He would talk about AACA-NA. He would say an addict, AA-NACA, an addict, an alcoholic needing a complete answer. So I had no problem going to other 12-step rooms. I'm saying, I'm going to any 12-step rooms, thank you, that will tell me how to do this program. And I was on my way, and, as soon as chip takers inspired me. And, by the way, while I'm thinking about Mark, I just want to say with the health challenge, you're right. We walk through those things. I see people walk through cancer all the time. And that leads me to the story of, at 2 years clean and sober, my sister developed stage 4 ovarian cancer. Like overnight, she had these companion diseases, and she had watched me get sober, and all of a sudden her brother is back, you know. The PTA dad is back. We have a relationship. We can talk about the spirit. We can talk about each other. She said, Gregory, I can't move my arms. And she had this other disease. It was called dermatomyositis, which means, you know, basically you've got a rare muscle disease. It came under Jerry Lewis's telethon aegis. So they helped her, and she was actually on that show. But anyway, I got on a plane. I flew there to help take care of her, take care of my niece. And, you know, they operated her on immediately. As soon as they diagnosed the cancer and saw how much it was, they went in and they tried to take it out, but they couldn't get all of it. And I talked to the surgeon right afterwards. And he says to me, he says, you know, I couldn't get all of it, but, you know, I know her primary physician is saying she's only got 3 months to live, but I'm not saying that. So when my sister came to after the operation, I said to her, I said, you know, you got to do what I had to do. You know, you got to find out everything you can about your disease. You got to get a posse, and you got to, you know, really find people who believe in you. And she did that. First, she fired her doctor. Her doctor said, you won't see spring, and this is in Chicago. And my sister's joke was, nobody sees spring in Chicago, you know. But I bring her up because she had the best, one of my favorite lines for surrender, because, you know, we talk about the first step and the acceptance and the surrender you have to go through to get there. And she said, you know, to surrender is to cooperate with the opportunity to grow. And I went, oh, I like that. I like that. She said, but you cannot surrender until you admit you're in a fight. Unless you admit you're in a fight, you can't surrender, you know? And that's it. And that sounds like the first step. And she was a writer, and she had been on TV in Chicago, and she had a lot of spiritual people in her life. And some of those people were in Alcoholics Anonymous. So when I got to Chicago, I actually had sponsors in Chicago who took me to meetings and helped me stay on the path of this program, which is really important when you're going through something like that. And they gave, you know, the doctor gave her 3 months to live. She got 4 years. She had a couple of remissions of this stage 4 cancer, which was really bad. And she came out here, she met my friends, a lot of them, some of them who are sitting here today, and really inspired them, and we inspired her, and she fell in love with us. She had always talked about AA, and she was a writer who had done some movies and television. And anyway, so I got 2 minutes, and in 2 minutes, I'm going to tell you my favorite first story. You know, today, you know, I have a number of sponsees. One of them just took a 2-year cake last Tuesday, and his mother was there, which really impressed me. You know, the 2 things I want to say really quick is that, you know, I had this bag, and I'm always carrying bags around now, like this one. See, I carry bags. And because I had this bag full of stuff I had written, of pictures that mattered to me, I left it on a bus bench, and got on the bus. And I realized, you know, a few miles down the road, I said, oh, my God, my life was in that bag. I said, no, if my life was in that bag, God would give it back to me. And that second, this is how long ago it was, my pager goes off. It's my ex-wife on the phone, and she says, I am not your secretary, but some kid called and said he found your bag. I call the kid up. I go see him. He read some poetry I'd written when I was 17 before I had ever, you know, done anything stronger than marijuana. He said, I thought you could help me with my cocaine problem. And I went, yeah, you know, and I showed him the book because I still had that little first, you know, 164 pages of Alcoholics Anonymous. He calls his parents, goes into rehab. And I thought, you know what? I may have screwed up my life. I may have buried, you know, opportunities that will never come again, but I can be of service. This thing works. And I'm going to keep doing this. And I have. You know, I've gotten, you know, sponsees who are older than I am, sponsees that have more time in the program than I am. You know, one thing I, you know, will say is that, you know, the quality of one's recovery is based on how deeply we ingrain these steps, these principles, these concepts into our lives. And before I shut up, because this is really the end of my talk, you know, when you go to Al-Anon, they suggest to you that you go to AA meetings because they want you to understand more about the disease of alcoholism. They want you to hear stories. And I'm here to tell you that if you're in AA and you've never been to Al-Anon, I suggest you go to some Al-Anon meetings because you will find out, as Bill Wilson used to say, a more practical application of our program than sometimes even we do. And with that, I'm going to thank you for listening and shut up. Okay, while we got the excess going, I got a question. Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Gregory. I know you got a pretty strong morning routine. I was hoping you'd share that with us.
asked me about my morning routine because he knows how I usually start a talk. I tell people, look, every day I get up, I thank God for another day sober, serene, sane, clean, at peace, surviving gracefully, living joyfully, in abundant love and grace. I really say that out loud. And then I say the 3rd step prayer out loud. I say the 7th step prayer out loud. I say the 11th step prayer out loud. And then I start complaining, and praying some more, But it reminds me that, look, this week was difficult. And this week I said, God, I pray to keep praying. I pray to keep doing this. I always assumed it was so easy, it was so powerful, it was so effective. I would never get to that point where what Bill used to talk about, which is, you just can't pray. And sometimes you just have to drag your ungrateful, sorry, self-pitying self and say, just help me. Just help me to be willing. And it has helped, and it really has. So that's my routine in the morning, and I try to do it again at the evening. I did it for years. Now I have to redevelop my evening, my 10-step and 11-step prayer at night because, look, at 18, things change, and it gets more difficult, and it's more important. And plus, people who get used to you having a spiritual life expect you to always have one, so, and you should. But that doesn't mean you don't have feelings, you don't have doubts, you don't have pain, you don't have sorrow. It just means that you take it to God. And so that's the answer to that question. Any others? Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Arthur. I'm an alcoholic. Did you ever think that maybe there was certain in the family and maybe you may have had after you found out that you were sober?
Oh, that's a great question. He said, did I ever think that the mental illness in my family, did I have it? And it would affect me after I got sober? Is that good? Yes. Well, absolutely. I was certain that I had it. I mean, I had studied it long enough. I said, look, I know I'm bipolar. I know I'm depressive. I don't know. And I know I have acted manic depressive. A lot of you guys, used to say, yeah, Gregory C. can really remind you of Jimi Hendrix. Manic depressive was like, I was aiming for manic depressive because at least I'll get something done, But the truth is that I knew that. And so one of the first things I did is I wanted to get a psychologist. I had hospitalized myself a couple times. You can't include every detail when you're talking. And so I went looking for a psychologist in the program. And he spoke here. And I said to him, look, I know you really believe in this program. I really believe in this program. But what else are we trying to do? What are we aiming for? And he said, I want you to be able to play joyfully, work productively, and give and receive love. And I went, oh, I like that. That's basically. But one of the things that happened, I quit smoking cigarettes after I had been sober just over 2 years. And now that's 15 years and plus after that. And I was going to quit caffeine. And I'll never forget, I said, Frank, now that I've quit smoking, I'm going to quit caffeine. He says, no, you're not. You quit drinking coffee, I'm going to put you on psych meds. That's how close, And to this day, I, make sure that I do things in moderation. But I want to say to anybody that thinks they have mental issues, please go to a professional. Please take it to a psychologist who understands this program. If they don't believe in this program, keep looking because there's tons of them. I was a big fan of Scott Peck because Scott Peck was a big fan of this program. And, you go back and look at the doctor's opinion and you look at the psychologists that supported this program. There's a lot of them. Hey, look, if you have a problem with alcohol now, they send you to AA from court. We know that because we have court card signers. But what they don't really suggest is that if you have mental health problems, that maybe if you apply this program in conjunction with, there is a getting better where there'll be less need for outside medication. But I believe, look, my numbers are that maybe 40% at least of alcoholics are also suffer from some form of mental illness. Look, our second step is, can we return to sanity? Obviously, we're dealing with mental illness. And what is this, Craig? A lot of people we use the joke that alcoholics are the elite of the mentally ill. And I think that's really true because really, we know this works, but what we don't know is why some of us get it and some of us don't. And I just want to say, for those people that are new, I can walk into a supermarket, I see those pretty new vodka bottles, there are times where, I don't have craving, but I say, there are times when you just don't want to hang out with people who are actively drinking if there's no other reason for me to be there. I need to be with people who are actively trying to get sober, who are actually on a spiritual path. I really do. And that's why, I go to so many bloody meetings. Yes. Yes.
As someone who's in more than one program, can you talk about how you work them similarly and how you work them differently?
As someone who's in more than one program, can I say how I work them similarly and how I work them differently? Yes, I had reason to go to an Overeaters Anonymous convention that I had been invited to the year before. And, I know I don't first come off as somebody who was overeating this thing, but, food was always a trigger for me, always. If we could, sugar was the first thing. There's more sugar. Give me the Captain Crunch. Give me all the sugar cereals there are. And so, when I went there, first of all, I was amazed at how many people at that convention were in other programs I go to. They were either in Al-Anon or they were in some other program, some other 12-step. I'd seen them in rooms. And what I realized reading other literature is, and you got to remember, Chuck Chamberlain, who wrote New Pair of Glasses, which is a book I really love, he talked about OA really dismissively, but he respected it because they put the 12 steps of AA to work. And, what I find is that I need to be teachable. I need to be a newcomer in those programs. I need to be willing to get a sponsor to act like I don't know, like I haven't already worked the steps in that program, because it's different. Especially, for me, when I got my first sponsee in Al-Anon, because I really, and look, as my friend Casey says, the Al-Anon chapters are in the big book. They're to the wives, family afterwards, to the employer. Those are Al-Anon chapters. They pull them right out of there. And, even though it started in 1955, it is really part of our program. So to be able to sponsor somebody else who has a problem with an alcoholic sibling or parent or child, it's really enlightening because they are coming from a different starting point. But the same steps apply, the same, mental illness is the same challenge. Mental obsession. Better, different, or more. I'm different, and alone. The two things I want to say is that, there were two descriptions in the big book that jumped out at me. The first one was pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization. That was the description for my first step. And it stays that way because it's pitiful is great because you're just, you're really, but pitiful, incomprehensible, I don't understand what happened. And demoralization, I'd just as soon be dead, And the other, which was a little healthier, which is restless, irritable, and discontent. So if I'm restless, irritable, and discontent around other programs, say, I know I'm, that close to being a gambler. If I go to Las Vegas or something, I want people with me. I want a plan. This is how much I'm going to spend. If I go beyond that, please grab me because I don't want to have to go to that program. But I got friends in GA, and I can use DA because I have problems with organization around debt and using and all these programs can draw their strength from us because they started there. So why not use them? Why not use them if you can? Yes.
That's great. Can you talk about the connection between your interests and experience of music and either alcoholism, recovery, and spirituality?
Music, alcoholism, recovery. This is my last question. Yeah, one thing about music growing up in the 60s is that, that whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing really appealed to me. I pursued it with all of my ability. And, but I was drawn to the spiritual aspect. I was drawn to, the storytelling of lyrics, the creation of people trying to reach an audience to communicate really important life stuff. And there's spirituality in that. I think of a lot of times, God is that, that good orderly direction. But I also think of it, in simpler terms, like get outdoors. Take an action. Because a spiritually disciplined life does not happen by accident. We have to do it. And, you know, one of the things that I said, look, I am a spiritual person first, religious second, but one thing I do religiously is not drink and not use drugs. And that forces me to have a spiritual life, because I need, you know, a buffer, especially living in Los Angeles. You know, I need a buffer between me and feelings that are overwhelming, between my struggles with depression. And if I didn't have a spiritual life, if I didn't know I have to be willing to give more than I'm comfortable giving, I have to be willing to be of service in areas where I'm uncomfortable and almost unwilling. I mean, look, if not for those days when somebody said, look, I really need somebody else to do this panel, please. Can you please come out and drive to Huntington Beach or further to speak at this meeting? And as much as I like talking, you know, and used to like driving, it's like I had other plans. But I think somebody was there for me, you know. That kid that I got to help helped me. And the spiritual truth of this is, man, when we're here like this, and it's, you know, continual, and you think of all the different meetings we go to, all the different family friends we have, people who've seen us change, you know, the amends we've made, you know, the ear we have to give people. Man, it changes things. To me, it's the best thing I have to give is my spiritual truth. And on a day like today, you know, and again, I want to say, you know, serving this meeting has been really an eye-opener. It really forced me to grow in ways that I really wanted to, and really ways I was really hoping not to. The last thing, you know, I mean, you know, last second I want to easier, softer way. The last thing I want to say, you know, Pete was the one that, because I really didn't, I ran one time and I didn't want to do it again. He says, are you sure? Don't you want to give back to this meeting? Don't you want to help decide how people receive this message, other people they listen to? Don't you want to do that? And I went, well, of course. Oh, all right. And then, you know, really soon after that, you know, he died, you know, and he was pursuing his health. It wasn't an accident, you know, that he went to see this doctor and had this done. And I gotta tell you, you know, he was such an example. But I realized you kind of made a promise. And since people had asked me to actually do this thing, I said, well, I better do it. And real quick, I got to this meeting by accident. I was in that meeting. Small, just a few people, you know, round robin, no major speaker, no big production, no piano player for sure. And the coffee guy was going to jail, Scott. And they said, would you, and it was Mark, would you be willing to make coffee? And I went, oh, okay, I don't know how to make 7 vats of coffee, but if he'll show me, I'll do it. He showed me. And, you know, and I watch him, you know, now at 13, and how incredibly generous and how incredibly hardworking he is in this program and beyond, and in this community. And I go like, man, that's why we say get commitments, because you will meet people who will change your life. And thank you for letting me speak.
I think we got a great talk going on here. Thanks for watching the channel. Taper Dave here. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. If that shows up, the gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.